The hostess looked at me like I'd wandered in from a dumpster behind the building. Her eyes traveled from my simple sundress to my worn canvas bag, and I could practically see her mentally calculating whether I could afford the breadbasket. She smiled that particular smile that service industry people reserve for customers they're already planning to ignore. I told her I was here for the Montgomery Chen rehearsal dinner, and she actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but an actual snort of disbelief. She suggested I might be looking for the staff entrance around back, since they were expecting some last-minute catering help. My name is Harper Chen. I'm 31 years old, and standing there in my deliberately understated outfit, I probably looked like someone who'd gotten the wrong address on a DoorDash delivery. The irony of the situation was almost too delicious, considering what I actually did for a living. But I kept my mouth shut and smiled. Sometimes the best lessons are taught in courses, like a 7-course tasting menu. My brother Daniel had called me 3 weeks ago with the enthusiasm of someone announcing their own root canal. He'd made it abundantly clear that I should try to dress appropriately for once because his fiancée, Vivian's family, the Montgomerys, were very refined people. He'd actually emphasized the word refined like it was italicized. He also mentioned, oh so casually, that maybe I shouldn't bring up my little app thing because the Montgomerys were old Charleston society and wouldn't understand tech stuff. The hostess was still staring at me, her perfectly microbladed eyebrow raised in judgment. I could have shown her my ID, could have made one phone call that would have changed everything. But where was the fun in that? Instead, I smiled sweetly and said I'd just wait at the bar until someone from the party could vouch for me. Her lip curled slightly, but she pointed toward the bar area like she was directing traffic away from a crime scene. I'd barely made it 3 steps when a familiar voice cut through the ambient jazz music. Vivian herself, resplendent in what had to be a $5,000 Valentino dress, came clicking across the marble floor in heels that could double as weapons. Her face cycled through confusion, mild recognition, and barely concealed horror in about 2 seconds flat. She looked at me, then at my outfit, then at the hostess who was explaining that she'd redirected the confused delivery person to wait at the bar. Vivian actually giggled, that particular laugh that people use when they're embarrassed on someone else's behalf. She waved her French manicured hand dismissively and said something about how some people just don't understand that there are dress codes for these events. Some people, her future sister-in-law. I bit my tongue so hard I could taste copper and walked toward the bar with my head held high. The bar area was gorgeous, all exposed brick and crystal chandeliers, with a view of the open kitchen where chefs in pristine whites were plating dishes that looked more like art than food. I ordered a sparkling water and watched the chaos unfold. Within minutes of sitting down, I'd already learned more about Vivian's family than I had in the 8 months Daniel had been engaged. The bartender, a young guy named Marcus who clearly hadn't gotten the memo about not gossiping with customers, was more than happy to share the tea. Apparently, the Montgomerys had been terrorizing the staff all week. Vivian's mother, Patricia, had called 6 times to change the menu because certain dishes weren't sophisticated enough for her guests. Vivian herself had made the event coordinator cry twice, once over the wrong shade of white for the napkins, and once because the flowers had too much greenery and not enough peonies. The centerpieces had been remade 4 times. The seating chart had been changed 11 times. And the bill, Marcus mentioned with a meaningful look, had a lot of special requests that were adding up very quickly. Before I continue, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Thank you. I was halfway through my sparkling water when Daniel finally appeared. My brother, 2 years older and perpetually disappointed in my life choices, spotted me at the bar, and his face did that thing where it tried to smile and grimace at the same time. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car, his hair perfectly styled, looking every bit the successful corporate lawyer he'd become. He walked over and immediately started whisper lecturing me about how I was already making things difficult. Vivian's mother had seen me from across the room and was asking why there was a waitress sitting at the bar, and he'd had to explain that I was his sister, which had led to this incredibly awkward conversation about whether I'd misunderstood the dress code. I looked down at my dress. It was a perfectly nice sundress, simple and elegant, exactly the kind of thing you'd wear to a casual rehearsal dinner. Apparently, the Montgomerys' definition of casual involved designer labels and judgment. Daniel sighed and told me to just try not to embarrass him tonight, then hurried back to his bride-to-be without even offering to introduce me properly to anyone. I watched him go, feeling that familiar ache of being the family disappointment. To Daniel and my parents, I was the one who dropped out of her stable accounting job 5 years ago to pursue some online business idea that they were convinced would fail. The fact that it hadn't failed, that it had actually succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, was something they wouldn't know because they'd never bothered to ask. I finished my water and made my way toward the private dining room where the party was being held. The room was stunning, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charleston Harbor, tables draped in white linen, and enough flowers to supply a botanical garden. The Montgomerys were holding court at the center of it all. Patricia Montgomery looked like she'd been vacuum-sealed into her cream-colored Chanel suit, her face bearing that peculiar tightness that suggested she and her plastic surgeon had been very busy lately. Her husband Richard stood beside her, a silver fox type who kept checking his phone like he had somewhere more important to be. And then there was Vivian, perched beside Daniel like she'd won a prize, introducing him to various relatives as her lawyer husband-to-be, as if his profession was his primary personality trait. I found my assigned seat, which was naturally at the table farthest from the bridal party, wedged between a distant cousin of Vivian's who was already 3 drinks deep and an empty chair that no one seemed to be claiming. The evening crawled by, course after course of exquisite food that I could barely taste because I was too busy listening to the Montgomerys talk about me like I wasn't there. Patricia was telling anyone who would listen that Daniel's family was perfectly pleasant but rather modest, which was Charleston code for poor. Richard was making jokes about how Daniel had really married up, emphasis on the up, and Vivian kept glancing my direction with a look that suggested I was a stain on an otherwise perfect evening. Then I heard something that made me sit up straight. Patricia was talking to another guest about the wedding finances, specifically about how Daniel's family would be contributing to the couple's investment portfolio as part of the marriage agreement. She made it sound casual, like discussing the weather, but I'd negotiated enough business deals to recognize a shakedown when I heard one. Daniel was nodding along, promising that his family had resources, that his father's retirement fund was quite healthy, and that his sister, me, had actually made some money with her tech thing and would definitely want to help the newlyweds get started. I nearly choked on my sea bass. Daniel was using me, the sister he directed to the dress code shame corner, as his financial backing. Vivian's brother Chad, because of course his name was Chad, appeared at my table with 2 glasses of wine and that particular smile that men with family money think is charming. He slid into the empty seat next to me and asked if I was enjoying the party. His eyes were doing that slow crawl that made my skin prickle with discomfort. He mentioned that Daniel had told him I did something with computers, and he was actually fascinated by entrepreneurial women who weren't afraid to take risks. The way he said risks made it sound like a euphemism for something else entirely. He leaned in closer, smelling of expensive cologne and entitlement, and told me that he invested in small businesses sometimes, tech startups especially. Maybe we could discuss my little project over drinks later, somewhere more private. I smiled politely and excused myself to the restroom, adding his proposition to my mental list of things that would make this evening more interesting. If you're still with me and enjoying this tale of family drama and hidden success, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your support helps more than you know, and trust me, the best part is yet to come. I didn't go to the restroom. Instead, I slipped out a side door and took the service elevator to the 4th floor, the executive level. I pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner outside suite 401, and the door clicked open. The space was everything the party downstairs wasn't. Quiet, minimal, with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Charleston skyline and a wall of monitors displaying security feeds from every angle of the restaurant. 3 years ago, I'd created an app called Table Sync that revolutionized restaurant reservations and management. It had been a side project, something I'd built in my apartment while eating ramen and ignoring my family's concerned phone calls about when I was going to get a real job. That app had sold for $47 million to a hospitality conglomerate. I'd used that money to do something my family would never expect. I bought restaurants. First one, then 3, then 12. The Harper view, the gorgeous establishment currently hosting my brother's rehearsal dinner, was the crown jewel of my collection. I'd acquired it 8 months ago, around the same time Daniel had gotten engaged. The timing was coincidental, but the irony was not lost on me. I pulled up the security footage from the private dining room. There they were, the Montgomerys in all their glory, Patricia adjusting her pearls while making cutting remarks about the flower arrangements she herself had approved. Richard was on his phone again, having what looked like an intense conversation in the corner, and Vivian was touching up her lipstick while Daniel fetched her another drink like a trained puppy. The story of how I'd built this empire while my family thought I was struggling with a little app thing was almost funny in hindsight. Daniel had been so proud of making partner at his law firm, always quick to offer me career advice and job listings he'd found that might be more suitable for someone at my level. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly building a restaurant empire, learning the business from the ground up, doing everything from washing dishes to negotiating real estate deals. I zoomed in on one of the cameras and noticed something interesting. Richard Montgomery was having his intense phone conversation with someone who was clearly not happy with him. His face was red, his gestures sharp and defensive. I pulled up the audio feed, one of the perks of owning the place and having very good surveillance equipment, and caught fragments of the conversation. Something about payments being late, something about the IRS, something about a lien on property. Curious, I switched cameras and spotted Patricia having her own private conversation with the restaurant's event coordinator, Sarah. But this wasn't a conversation about napkin colors. Patricia was pressing something into Sarah's hand, something that looked suspiciously like cash. Sarah was nodding nervously, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to refuse. I made a mental note to speak with Sarah later. Then I noticed Chad. He was back at my empty seat, looking confused, checking his phone. He typed something, and a moment later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hey, beautiful. Disappeared on me? Let me know if you want that private conversation about investing. I can be very generous with the right people." The audacity was almost impressive. I pulled up my laptop and did what I always did when something felt off in my business dealings. I researched. 2 hours later, I had a complete picture of the Montgomery family, and it was not the portrait of old Charleston money they were pretending to be. Richard's investment firm had collapsed 3 years ago. They'd been living off credit and the sale of family heirlooms ever since. Their family estate had 2 mortgages. Patricia's jewelry, the pieces she was showing off tonight, were actually high-quality replicas. The originals had been sold at auction last year. And Chad, the aspiring venture capitalist? His investment portfolio consisted of a string of failed businesses and one pending lawsuit from a woman who claimed he'd promised her funding in exchange for favors. Suddenly, everything made sense. The Montgomerys weren't trying to stop the wedding because Daniel wasn't good enough. They were desperate for it to happen because they thought my family had money. The financial contributions Patricia had mentioned weren't wedding gifts. They were hoping for a bailout, and Daniel, my clueless brother, was walking straight into a trap. The cosmic joke of it all was almost too perfect. Here were the Montgomerys, looking down their surgically enhanced noses at me, while secretly being one bad quarter away from bankruptcy. And here was Daniel, pretending our family was wealthier than we were to impress people who were pretending even harder. I went back to the footage of Patricia and Sarah. Using some specialized software my tech team had developed, I cleaned up the audio and got the full conversation. Patricia was bribing Sarah to mess with the dessert service, specifically to make sure something went wrong that could be blamed on my brother's side of the family. She wanted an excuse to postpone the wedding, to buy more time to extract money from Daniel before the ceremony made things legally complicated. I also found footage of Patricia going through my mother's purse earlier in the evening when Mom had left it at her seat to use the restroom. Patricia had photographed my mother's driver's license, credit cards, and what looked like bank statements my mother had been carrying for some reason. The kind of information you'd need to run a credit check or set up fraudulent accounts. I saved all the footage, made several backup copies, and changed back into my role as invisible family disappointment. The dessert course was just being served when I returned to the dining room. My mother was looking flustered, patting her purse like she sensed something was wrong but couldn't figure out what. My father was making awkward small talk with Richard, who was barely pretending to listen. And Daniel was giving a toast, thanking the Montgomerys for welcoming him into their family, for showing him what true elegance and class looked like. The irony would have been funnier if it wasn't so sad. I slipped back into my seat just as things started to go wrong. The dessert, a beautiful chocolate soufflé, arrived at the main table perfectly. But the soufflés delivered to the Chen family tables, meaning my parents, my aunt, my cousins, and me, were disasters. Collapsed, burnt on the edges, practically inedible. Patricia was already tutting, loudly, about how some people just couldn't handle a sophisticated menu. Vivian was whispering to Daniel, who was turning red with embarrassment. This was supposed to be the moment where my family looked incompetent, where Patricia could suggest that maybe the wedding needed to be postponed until everyone was better prepared. But Patricia had made one critical mistake. She'd tried to sabotage the food in my restaurant, in my house. And in my house, the house always wins. I stood up from my table. The movement was small, but something in my posture must have changed because several people turned to look. I walked calmly toward the main table, passing servers who did double takes when they recognized me, their eyes widening in sudden understanding. The head chef, Marco, who I'd personally hired from a 3-Michelin-star restaurant in New York, caught my eye through the kitchen window. I gave him a small nod. Patricia was in the middle of suggesting, quite loudly, that perhaps the evening had been too ambitious for everyone involved when I reached the main table. I cleared my throat softly and said in my best CEO voice that I thought there'd been some confusion about the dessert service. Everyone turned to look at me. The family disappointment, the girl in the simple sundress who couldn't even follow a dress code. Vivian actually rolled her eyes. Daniel looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Patricia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass as she said something about how sweet it was that I wanted to help. But perhaps this wasn't the appropriate time for input from someone who didn't understand how these events worked. I smiled back, equally sharp. That's when Marco emerged from the kitchen, followed by Sarah, the event coordinator, and James, my head of operations for all 12 restaurants. Actually, I said, I understand quite well how these events work. I should, considering I own this restaurant, and the 11 others in my portfolio. The silence that followed was the kind you could package and sell as soundproofing. Patricia's face went through confusion, disbelief, and finally settled on something that looked like fear. Richard's phone slipped from his hand. Chad actually spit out his wine. Daniel was staring at me like I'd just announced I was actually 3 raccoons in a dress. I continued, my voice calm and professional, the same voice I used in boardrooms and investor meetings. I'm Harper Chen, founder of TableSync and owner of the Harborview Restaurant Group. I've owned this particular establishment for 8 months now. Funny how that never came up in conversation. I turned to Sarah, who was clutching a folder I'd had James bring her. Sarah, would you like to tell everyone about your conversation with Mrs. Montgomery earlier this evening? The one where she paid you $300 to sabotage the dessert service? Sarah looked at Patricia, then at me, and decided which side of this particular power dynamic she wanted to be on. She opened the folder and pulled out screenshots from the security footage, clear images of Patricia handing over cash and giving instructions. Mrs. Montgomery asked me to make sure the dishes for your family's tables were ruined, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. She said it would be a funny prank, but I knew it wasn't. I'm sorry. I was going to refuse, but I was scared of losing my job. I told her she wouldn't lose her job for doing the right thing, though we'd be having a conversation about accepting bribes in the future. Then I pulled out my phone and connected it to the room's AV system, another perk of owning the venue. I'd had the screen set up for a slideshow of Daniel and Vivian's engagement photos. Instead, security footage began to play. There was Patricia, clear as day, going through my mother's purse. There she was photographing credit cards and identification. And there was the audio of her phone call, with what I could now identify as a private investigator, discussing how to access the Chen family's financial records. The room erupted. My mother gasped and clutched her purse. My father stood up, his face red with anger. Daniel was staring at his future mother-in-law with dawning horror. Vivian was shrieking at me to stop, that I was ruining everything, that I was just jealous because I'd never have what she had. I let her rant for about 30 seconds. It was actually impressive how many accusations she could fit into such a short time. Then I held up a second folder. I also thought the family might be interested in the Montgomerys' actual financial situation, I said calmly. Public records show that your investment firm collapsed 3 years ago, Richard. You have 2 mortgages on your estate, outstanding debts to several creditors, and 3 lawsuits pending from former clients. Patricia's jewelry tonight is fake, copies of originals that were sold at auction. And Chad, I added, turning to the man who'd propositioned me earlier, you have a pending harassment lawsuit and a string of failed businesses. Would you like me to read the details of that lawsuit aloud? Or would you prefer to leave quietly? Chad was already moving toward the exit. Patricia was trying to explain, but the evidence was literally larger than life on the screens around her. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Vivian had stopped shrieking and was now crying, mascara running down her face in expensive streaks. Daniel stood frozen between his fiancée and his family, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd been sleepwalking toward a cliff. I turned to him and softened my voice slightly. They were going to use you, Daniel. The financial contributions they mentioned, they weren't planning to invest in your future. They were planning to drain Mom and Dad's retirement, max out their credit in your name, and disappear when the money ran out. Daniel's face went through about 7 emotions in 3 seconds. He turned to Vivian, who was still crying, and asked her quietly if she'd known. Her hesitation was answer enough. She started babbling about how it wasn't supposed to be like this, how she really did love him, how her parents had just needed a little help. She said that once they got married, things would be different. Daniel took a step back from her, and something in his expression shifted. The hopeful, eager-to-please man who'd spent the evening fetching drinks and accepting insults was gone. In his place was someone who looked a lot more like my brother. The brother who used to stick up for me when kids made fun of my glasses, before law school and career ambitions turned him into someone I barely recognized. Now, I announced to the room, let's discuss the bill for this evening. It comes to $12,400, including the special requests, the custom menu changes, the 4 redesigns of the centerpieces, and the 6-time revision of the seating chart. Since the Montgomerys apparently can't cover their debts, I'll absorb it as an early wedding gift to my brother, assuming there's still going to be a wedding. The Montgomerys didn't wait to find out. Patricia grabbed Richard's arm and practically ran for the exit, their dignity trailing behind them like toilet paper on a shoe. Chad had already disappeared. The door clicked shut behind them with a finality that felt like punctuation. Vivian was left standing alone, her perfect evening in ruins around her. She looked at Daniel with mascara-streaked desperation and said she was sorry, that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She said she loved him. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone, including me. "I believe you didn't know about all of it," he said slowly, "but you knew some of it. You knew they were in trouble, and you let them use our relationship as a lifeline without telling me." Vivian started crying harder, but she didn't deny it. Daniel took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and walked over to where I was standing. For a moment, we just looked at each other. 2 siblings who'd somehow become strangers over the years. "You really own all this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the restaurant. "All 12 locations," I confirmed. $52 million in revenue last year. "I tried to tell you once, but you said you didn't have time to hear about my little blog project." Daniel flinched. That hit home. He reached out and hugged me, which he hadn't done in probably 5 years. "I'm sorry," he said into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Harper. I've been such an idiot." I hugged him back. "Yeah," I agreed. "You really have been. But you're still my brother, and I would have helped you if you'd just asked. That's what family does." Our parents joined us, both looking shell-shocked. My mother was clutching her purse like it might try to escape, still processing the fact that a woman she'd been trying to impress had been planning to steal her identity. My father was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You own restaurants," he said finally. 12 of them. 13, actually, I corrected. "I'm closing on a new property next month." He was quiet for another moment, then shook his head slowly. "And you never told us. I tried, Dad, multiple times. But every time I brought up work, someone changed the subject to Daniel's career or asked when I was going to get a real job. After a while, I stopped trying. The guilt on their faces was almost too much. Almost. We dealt with the remaining guests, most of whom had been recording the entire debacle on their phones, because of course they had. The Montgomerys' social standing in Charleston was about to take a significant hit. The story would be all over the society pages by morning. I comped everyone's meals and sent them home with gift cards, partly as an apology for the dramatic entertainment and partly because good PR never hurt anyone. The staff got the rest of the night off with full pay plus a bonus for dealing with the Montgomery chaos. The extra food went to a local shelter. The flowers went to the children's hospital. Nothing went to waste except the Montgomerys' dignity, but they didn't have much of that to begin with. Daniel found me on the terrace overlooking the harbor as the last guests were leaving. He'd been inside talking to Vivian, and I could tell from his expression that it hadn't been easy. "She's going home to pack," he said quietly. "We're calling off the engagement." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Even though they were terrible, I know you cared about her." He nodded, leaning against the railing. "I did. Or I cared about who I thought she was, maybe who I wanted her to be." He was quiet for a moment. "You know the worst part? I spent so much energy trying to impress them that I forgot to actually get to know them. I was so focused on being good enough that I never stopped to ask if they were good enough for me." I bumped my shoulder against his. "That's a pretty good realization for someone who just had his engagement implode." He laughed, just a little. "Yeah, well, having your sister turn out to be a secret restaurant mogul really puts things in perspective." We stood there for a while, watching the boats in the harbor, the lights of the city reflected on the water. It felt like the first honest moment we'd had in years. The next morning, I offered Daniel a job, not out of pity, but because I'd seen the way he'd handled the fallout with Vivian. Calm, fair, and surprisingly compassionate for someone who'd just discovered his fiancé's family had been planning to rob him. I told him I needed a general counsel for my restaurant group, someone I could trust. He'd have to learn the hospitality industry from the ground up, spend time in every department, understand the business before he could represent it. He accepted. 3 months later, Daniel had worked in every one of my restaurants. He'd done prep shifts, dishwashing shifts, front-of-house shifts, and management shadows. He'd learned more about actual people and actual work than he had in 10 years of corporate law. He'd also apologized to every family member he'd ever dismissed or condescended to, which was a longer list than he'd expected. Chad Montgomery tried to sue me for defamation, but it's hard to claim defamation when everything said about you is documented in court records. The lawsuit was dismissed. He moved to Miami. Patricia and Richard lost their estate 2 months later. Last I heard, they were renting an apartment and Richard was working as a consultant for a company that probably didn't know about his track record. Vivian actually reached out to me, about 6 months after the rehearsal dinner disaster. She'd gotten therapy, gotten a job, and wanted to apologize properly. "Not to get Daniel back," she said, "just because it was the right thing to do." I met her for coffee at one of my restaurants. We talked for 2 hours. She wasn't the person I'd thought she was that night, but she wasn't entirely innocent either. She'd known her parents were struggling. She'd hoped that marrying Daniel would fix things without having to confront the reality of their situation. She'd let desperation make her complicit. I appreciated the honesty. I didn't offer her a job, but I did tell her about a friend who was hiring for an entry-level marketing position. She took it. Daniel met someone new last month, a sous chef at my original restaurant. She's kind, funny, and completely unimpressed by his law degree. She makes him laugh. She also makes incredible pasta. I approve. The hostess from that first night, the one who directed me to the staff entrance, found me last week. She'd heard through the restaurant industry grapevine who I actually was and wanted to apologize. I told her what I'd told the security guard in stories like this. It's not about what you did when you didn't know. It's about what you do now that you do know. She nodded, looking like she might cry. Then she asked if we were hiring at any of our locations. I said I'd check. Last I heard, she's working at our newest property, training other hosts on how to treat every guest like they might own the building. Because honestly, you never know. Some people wear their success on their sleeves. Others wear simple sundresses and canvas bags and wait to see how you'll treat them when you think they're nobody. The rehearsal dinner footage never went viral. I made sure of that. It wasn't about humiliating the Montgomerys publicly. It was about protecting my family. But among the Charleston social scene, word spread quickly enough. The Montgomerys became a cautionary tale about assuming you know someone's worth based on their appearance, and my family finally started asking about my work. Not because I'd proved myself with money or success, but because they'd finally realized they'd been missing out on knowing who I actually was. These days, Sunday dinner at my parents' house includes lengthy discussions about menu planning and restaurant management. My dad has opinions about everything from wine pairings to table spacing. My mom keeps suggesting loyalty program ideas. Daniel gives unsolicited legal advice about vendor contracts. It's annoying and wonderful, and exactly what I'd wanted all along. Just to be seen, just to be heard, just to be part of the family, not as the disappointment, but as myself. Oh, and one more thing. Remember that hostel hostess who wanted me to use the staff entrance? She's now the assistant manager at my flagship location. She told me recently that she thinks about that night all the time, how close she came to treating someone badly based on nothing but appearances. I told her that's exactly why I hired her. Some of the best lessons come from our worst moments, and some of the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just living your truth and letting the chips fall where they may, preferably at a really nice restaurant that you happen to own.